This lesson provides an overview of the digestive system starting with its anatomy. Now, if we want to really simplify things, you can think of your digestive system as a long tube with the rest of your body around it. Food comes in at one end, it gets broken down and absorbed, and then wastes go out the other end. And so if we think about it in that simplified fashion, we can consider, let's say we've got a peptide that comes in here that's made up of a bunch of amino acids strung together. We can consider what's happening to that, and that helps us see the functions that the GI system, the digestive system, has to perform. GI stands for gastrointestinal. So one of them is that we need to break this down into smaller bits. We generally don't absorb macromolecules in their intact form, but we break them down into the monomers that they're made of, and then we absorb those. So digestion is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food. Mechanical, for example, like chewing in your mouth or moving it around in your stomach, and chemical using enzymes to break down the food. So here we see digestion. And then there's absorption. Absorption is taking those breakdown products from the gut lumen. The interior of a hollow organ is called the lumen, so from the lumen into the body. This would be absorption. Less obvious might be secretion. We actually put a lot of fluid into the digestive tract. In fact, you only eat about 2 liters of food and liquids every day, but you actually put in about 7 liters of secretions into the gastrointestinal tract. And that's enzymes and saliva and bile, as we'll talk about shortly. And then most of that is reabsorbed. And then the other thing that the digestive system has to do is keep that food or partially digested food moving along so that it can be processed and absorbed. And that's done by a mechanism called peristalsis. Peristalsis is a wave-like movement of contractions down the GI tract, where, as we'll see shortly, there are both circular muscles running in this direction, and longitudinal muscles running in this direction along this tube, and they contract and relax in such a way to push the food down the digestive tract. So that's peristalsis. It's this wave-like motion of contractions involving these two different sets of muscles that we'll see in a moment. Let's take a look at an overview of the anatomy of the digestive system, and let's follow food that we eat as it passes through. So here is the oral cavity and then the tongue, and we're going to chew that. That's the first part of digestion or breakdown, and then food is going to arrive back here at the throat area. That area, the throat area, is called the pharynx. In the pharynx, we have both food and liquid, and then we also have air. And then it's just below that it gets separated. Food goes down into the esophagus, whereas air for breathing goes into the trachea. Now, the trachea is not shown here, but it's in front of your esophagus. You can feel your trachea if you feel your neck, because it's in front of your esophagus. So the trachea is not part of the digestive system, but it's here. And we need to obviously keep food from going down into our trachea, our windpipe, and that's done by a little projection here that's called the epiglottis, and that closes over the trachea when we swallow. So again, the epiglottis, which is here, is not part of the digestive system, but I'm showing it because it's important. These 3 yellow things here are the salivary glands. There's a parotid gland, a submandibular, and a sublingual salivary gland. And they secrete saliva, which includes enzymes as well as mucus. So those are the salivary glands. So food is now going down into the esophagus. It's being pushed down in the esophagus by that peristalsis that we talked about before, and then it gets to the stomach. Now, as we'll see in a number of places, there are sphincters. Sphincters are like purse-like arrangements of muscle that contract around openings, and there's one here, for example. This is called the lower esophageal sphincter, and that's going to control movement of food into the stomach. So the lower esophageal sphincter is there. I'll point out some of the other sphincters as we go along. The stomach is a site of digestion, so the stomach secretes acid, it secretes hydrochloric acid, and it also secretes enzymes like pepsin for digesting proteins. But stuff's not being absorbed here, it's just being digested, and there's mechanical movement that is aiding in digestion as well. Here there is another sphincter as well. This is called the pyloric sphincter, where food is going to leave the stomach. and go into the small intestine. Now, just note that here I've skipped some important things that are shown. This is the liver, and this is the gallbladder. The liver has a whole lot of functions. It makes bile, which is involved in emulsifying fats or breaking fats into smaller droplets. It's involved in glucose metabolism. It detoxifies substances that are in the blood, so detoxification. It does some protein synthesis. It's really a very multi-purpose organ. It's also involved in recycling red blood cells, or red blood cell breakdown. So a whole host of things that the liver does. And the gallbladder stores the bile that the liver has produced. So the liver produces the bile and the gallbladder stores it. And then they empty here through a duct into the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. So this is the duodenum over here. And that's the first part of the small intestine. Over here, this is the pancreas. And the pancreas is another organ that has a number of functions. It has an endocrine or hormone function, and that controls glucose in our bloodstream. So insulin and glucagon, which control the sugar level in our blood, and it's the pancreas that's involved in diabetes. And it also makes and secretes enzymes. And so that's called its exocrine function. And those enzymes are involved in the breakdown of carbohydrates and lipids and proteins. So the pancreas makes enzymes for breaking down all of the different kinds of nutrient macromolecules. So again, this is the endocrine function, endocrine for hormone. And this is the exocrine function. Exocrine is the term that we use when something is secreting into a hollow organ. Now I didn't mention, but over top here there is a dome-shaped muscle that's again not part of the digestive tract, but is important to know about, and that's the diaphragm. We'll talk more about the diaphragm when we talk about ventilation or breathing, because it's the contraction of the diaphragm and pushing down that increases the space in the chest cavity and allows us to breathe in. But so the liver here is sitting, and the stomach are sitting just under the diaphragm. So back to the food that's going through here, it's been through the stomach. It's been partially broken down by the churning action in the stomach, as well as the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin, and now the partially digested food, which is called chyme. That's the name for the partially digested food that is being moved through the GI tract. That chyme is now moving into the duodenum, and then it receives the secretions from the gallbladder, which is going to help break down fats. That's bile, which does that. And then the secretions from the pancreas, these enzymes, which break down carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Now, most of the absorption happens in the small intestine. The small intestine consists of three parts. We've already seen one part, the duodenum, and then the other two parts in order are the jejunum and the ileum. And there's no really clear starting or stopping point between these, but altogether they make up the small intestine. And the small intestine is where most absorption takes place. So most of the absorption of the nutrients that we take in happens in the small intestine. Then moving from the small intestine, we get into the large intestine, or the colon, and movement through the large intestine goes here. So here's the opening between the ileum and the first part of the large intestine, and then food's going to go in this direction over the top and then down. So this is the large intestine. The large intestine is also called the colon, and in the colon, or in the large intestine, water and ions are absorbed as well. There are lots of bacteria that help to digest other parts of the food that we couldn't digest on their own. But most of the nutrients have actually already been absorbed back in the small intestine. There's another sphincter here between the small intestine and the large intestine, and then food goes through the large intestine until it reaches the rectum where feces is finally stored, and then the anus where it's expelled. And the anus is not actually one sphincter, it's actually two sphincters, an internal and an external sphincter. And what I've skipped over here is the appendix, which is what gets inflamed and then removed in an appendectomy. So that's a quick tour of the structures, or the major structures, of the digestive tract, and we followed food as it's gone on its trip all the way through the digestive tract. Now that we've seen that overview, let's do a cross-section of the GI tract and see what that looks like in cross-section. So here we're looking at the small intestine specifically, and there's going to be differences in different parts of the GI tract, but the same basic plan exists throughout. So what we're doing here is we are cutting like that, and we are looking at this end on. So in the middle, we said that the hollow part, the hollow middle of a hollow organ is called the lumen. So here's the lumen in here, and then the first layer, so this is where the food is being digested, the first layer here is called the mucosa, because it is a mucous membrane and secretes mucus. And that has on the inside an epithelium. An epithelium is a single layer of cells, and that's what's doing the absorption and doing the secretion. And the mucosa has a very large surface area. A large surface area in order to be able to absorb lots and lots of nutrients. And as we'll see in another lesson, that surface area is increased by villi, which are finger-like projections of the mucosa, as well as microvilli, which are these little finger-like projections of the individual epithelial cells. So there's lots and lots of surface area because of those two things. So that's the mucosa, and then inside that, or outside that, I guess, depending on which way you look at it, is the submucosa. The submucosa, which is underneath the mucosa, has blood vessels as well as lymphatic vessels, and then also nerves. You might have heard the gut referred to as the second brain because there are so many nerves within the gut, and because it can regulate itself and also has effects on the rest of the body, which are quite significant. So some of those nerves are in the submucosa. Then there are two layers of muscle shown separately here. There is a circular layer of muscle that is closer to the lumen, and then outside of that you have the longitudinal muscle. And so the circular muscle runs around like this, whereas the longitudinal muscle runs like this. The circular muscle will contract on one side of food that's being pushed in a direction and relax on the other side. So let me explain that a bit more clearly. If we're moving food in this direction, if you relax the circular muscle over here, here's the food, let's say, relax the circular muscle here and contract this, it'll squish the food that way. So longitudinal and circular muscle, with circular muscle on the lumen or closer to the lumen side. And then the last layer here is called the serosa. That's connective tissue that surrounds the gut in the abdominal cavity. So that's a quick overview of the digestive system and the major anatomical structures.